Eric Burgess here with Music Marketing TV, and today using Saturn II, we're going to be diving into the fundamental principle of saturation. If you understand this idea, then you understand the majority of what you need to know in order to use saturation in your tracks, in your sound design, in your mixing. It really comes down to one simple idea. Saturation takes frequencies it is given and produces new frequencies above it. And it sounds simple, but it's got a lot of implications. Let's start with the most basic example. We're going to start with a sine wave. So here is a sine wave. It's a sine wave. We've got a second harmonic here because of the mode we're in. So we're going to go to a mode that's a bit cleaner. We're going to go over to gentle transformer. And we get just the pure sine wave coming in. All right, so that's just a sine wave. Now, the entire idea here in all types of saturation and distortion, there are ways of getting around this, is that this sine wave, when we saturate or distort it, will produce harmonics that are only above it. Okay, so as I move this up, we'll see new harmonics show up above it. I will mention here, there are ways of getting harmonics below it and doing all sorts of weird stuff. We might get into that into another video, but in this video, most distortion plugins are going to follow this rule. And so as we bring the distortion up, the drive up, this big one in the middle, harmonics appear. And this is very, very common. You see a lot of videos talk about this. They say, oh, look, the harmonics show up. And if we change different modes, for example, if we went to like tape and we went for warm tape, they look different. They're produced differently. But the whole point is they are above what we gave it. So we gave it one tone, one frequency, and it produced a whole bunch of new frequencies, an entire spectrum of new frequencies. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, but Saturn II is a multi-band distortion. And that means we can do some pretty cool things here using this information. So the next thing I want to point out is if that's true, when we feed it one frequency, we get a whole bunch of new ones, then what would happen when we feed it two frequencies, right? I think you can sort of guess in your mind. Let's go ahead and add a second note. We'll put a C in. So now we've got two frequencies. If we take this all the way down, we have two right here. Let's go back to the transformer. So we're just really, really clean. In fact, and let's even put them further apart, right? So that they're easy to distinguish when they're separated. You know, sounds that we have very rarely have one frequency. They usually have an entire spectrum, and the spectrum is changing. So there's a bunch of additional aspects to consider. But if we go to the next easiest step, we add a second frequency. Well, here, look at this. I could place a band and split it. Now, we're going to talk about the implications of this crossover, but for now, I'm going to put it at 48 dB per octave on both sides. And what this does is it ensures that we're really separating our frequencies into one band or the other. They're not bleeding together at all. All right, now on this side, I'm going to turn the distortion off. No saturation, no nothing fancy. And on this side, I'll leave it on. Now, when I turn it on over here, let's just turn it way up. We generate harmonics. Now, if I were to turn this side off and turn this side on, this side will generate harmonics. Very, very different harmonics. Now, when we put them together, both frequencies will produce a set of harmonics. If we turn them both on. And we end up getting the summation of them. I actually did a bunch of experiments because I was curious how this worked. This side over here does not receive the higher harmonics generated by the lower band. It doesn't. And so this leads us to one of our first really important realizations, is that we can saturate the high end, and because harmonics only appear above, they don't appear below, we can put this a Saturn II on a sound and really tidy up the high end and not have to worry at all about what's happening to the low end. Now, you saw earlier, the mode we pick can be significant. So on the low end, we might pick like gentle transformer or something that's really, really transparent, because even when you disable it, this algorithm will still affect your audio. And so just be aware of that. And I could show you, in case you just didn't see it earlier, let's just open up another Saturn. And here we go, Saturn 2. And it's right on the default, which is warm tape. And now I've turned off the first one. And so even if I turn this off, we should be getting a sine wave coming in, right? So let's just open this one up so it's less confusing. But if we play it, we see a whole bunch of extra harmonics. And in fact, let's just go down to one frequency so it's extra clear. There are two frequencies there. That's a bit strange. And just to prove to you that Saturn is putting it in there, that the algorithm still affects it even if the band has been disabled. Let's go to a wave candy. We'll put a wave candy on here, and we'll turn this up. This is important to know when you run something through here, you have a Saturn in your chain, you got to know exactly how it's sort of behaving. So this is before we hit Saturn, and we are only going to see one frequency. And in fact, I will change the scale, not that scale, this scale, so that it's easier to see. So there's our tone, pure tone. After Saturn, however, we have a second tone. Now, just to sort of show you, because I think this is, when you're new, it's important to sort of see these kinds of things. If I change it, let's go ahead and click on, oh, whoops, we can't change it while we're disabled. So enable it. If I change it to a transformer, which are a lot more transparent, like we go with subtle transformer, no such tone appears. So that's one reason why you see people say, hey, you use these for mastering. And if you're going to use these, you got to be aware of that, because keep in mind, when we fed in one tone, one additional frequency showed up. But if you feed in two tones, two additional frequencies will show up. And if you feed in an entire spectrum, a whole spectrum of new frequencies will show up. So you got to be aware of these things. That's why when people say, oh, I use this for this application, there's some of the reasons for why that happens. And so if I were to toss this on a master bus, now, of course, if it sounds good, it's good. So if you think, hey, tape sounds like freaking awesome, then you should toss the tape on there. But if you think that, hey, you know, this, I'm not liking what this is doing, you could always try out transformer, and you know that it's going to be a lot more transparent. Like, you literally just know this before you do it because you've seen these things. Now let's go ahead and move up to the next implication. So we've got two implications. The mode we pick is important. That's an important thing. We've seen that we can only add harmonics above it. We know there are other methods that can actually get harmonics below, and we'll get to those in some other video. And now what we want to do is we want to say, okay, in multiband, we also know, this is another important takeaway, that, let me delete this wave candy. It is in our way. Here we go. Be gone, wave candy. We also know that harmonics generated here will not be processed again by the band above it. So the bands don't like link into each other. So if we were to actually, if we wanted to take the distortion that this band generates and generate more harmonics, we'd actually have to open a second fab filter. So let me show you that. So here we've got our tone. It's right here. And I'm going to put a drive on it that's pretty heavy. And we can see our harmonics show up. Let's go for something that's just produces some really obvious drive. We will go for tube, and we will go for warm tube. So there it is. Pretty obvious drive going on. And now, if I were to turn this side on, and we could also go to warm tube. And let's talk about the crossover here for a second. So this crossover is important to understand. This band will cross. They literally, it looks just like this symbol. There's two filters that they cross over each other, and that's how it separates it into different areas of the spectrum, like the low area and the higher area. And if this is a very long crossover, it might still grab some of this frequency. Like 6 dB per octave is like, you know, it comes out like this. It's very, very broad. Versus like 48 dB per octave is very, very short. So we're guaranteed, not guaranteed, but it's at this point, we're pretty sure nothing of this part is going to get over here. So when you want really good separation, you're going to choose this. But if you want things to blend a bit more, maybe have the distortion effect taper off in the spectrum, you're going to pick a higher crossband. There's other benefits that come with it, but that's the big reason I usually pick what I'm picking. And so I'm going to go for 48 because I really want this to be separate to show you that even though there are clearly frequencies up here, and we've got our fundamental, and this is the frequency that's really responsible for generating them because we're driving it really hard with a warm tube. If I grab another warm tube and drive it up really hard, check this out. Do you think it'll sound any different? It sounds no different. And that's because, like I said before, these bands don't receive the next frequency up. But if I were to open up another Saturn and put it afterwards, so we have two Saturns in a chain, and this is one reason why you might choose to do chained processing. We have a warm tape. Let's go ahead, split it. We'll put it up here because we know that the frequency we have is down there. And on this side, we're going to turn it off. And before we turn it off, we're going to put it on transformer, subtle transformer, and then we'll turn it off just for extra good measure. Now check it out. You get a different tone, a different sound. And so that's one reason why you might grab it and do things this way. All right, there's one other point that I want to point out before we get into the application. So these are all the basic ideas that you should be aware of when you're making decisions. So these would drive a lot of mixing decisions. Like, oh, this is why I would choose to put bands this way, and I would choose the algorithm I did a particular way, or why I have two Saturns instead of just one. So there is one other thing in here. So let's get rid of the second one. Let's also get rid of the first one because it can be confusing with so many. Okay, so here we have just one Saturn, and we'll even go to the default setting. There is a dynamics knob down here, and this dynamics knob is a pretty special dude. So the way saturation and distortion work is they generally work on the shape of the waveform. And so if your waveform has moments where it's very high and low, like it's just going up like a ton, and then they have moments where they're really tiny, the moments where they're really tiny is going to be much less affected because the shape of the waveform is so much smaller than when it's big. Now, this isn't true for every algorithm out there, but this is true for a lot of them. And so what you might do to try and change the tone of a distortion, because we know it's based around the shape of the wave, well, one way to do that is to change it with a compressor. And then we would make those smaller parts physically bigger. Well, I guess physically is kind of a weird way to think of it, but we would make them bigger so that they're more affected by distortion. And that's exactly what this dynamics does. So one way actually sucks down things and makes them, and this is like more like pumping. And I'm not as interested in that way. What I want to focus on is actually when we go the other way. We will pull, well, I'm not actually sure the type of compression that's implemented here, but we're going to make the waves bigger. And because they're bigger, things that weren't as affected by the drive before will now be more affected. And this can bring out properties of the sound that you may not have been aware of before, such as the space that it was recorded in. That often comes out a lot more when you do this, and sometimes in a very bad way, and other times in a really great way. Sine waves are the same the whole time. So it's not a good example to use. So we're going to now jump over to our application. But if we really quick just went over everything in like a nutshell, we learned that when we use these methods of distortion, at least most of them, they will produce harmonics strictly above what we gave it. So if we gave it a frequency, the new ones generated will go above that one. And we do this because we think it sounds good. And then if we give it more frequencies, those additional frequencies in the band. So if there were 5 frequencies in the drive band, like if I had a band here that was being driven, those would all produce their own set of additional harmonics. So that's another important takeaway. We talked about the implications of the crossover and why we might choose a sharper crossover versus a wider crossover. And we also talked a bit about the distortion and the mode that we would pick and why some modes we would pick a certain way for certain applications, such as mastering. We might go for the transformer modes because they are a lot more transparent. And we know that modes like tape or tube are going to add a lot more color. We call it color to the sound. So let's go ahead and dive into an application. So I'm going to delete this, and I have here this really simple track that's got some guitar and some drums. So you get the idea here. So we've got some nice guitar going. That hopefully gave you a little bit of time to listen and get acclimated. On the guitar, we're going to try out some of our ideas that we just discussed. So we're going to go ahead and put on a Saturn. We're going to grab a Saturn 2. And first, let's just give this sound a look-see. And so first off, you know, this low end of the guitar, this stuff, I don't really want to touch that. As soon as you start saturating, doing stuff down there, it can get a bit tricky to clean later, but I think we can do some stuff with the high end of the guitar, the stuff on this side. So the first move I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to a subtle transformer and place a band somewhere around here-ish. And I'm going to make it, you know, somewhat sharp. I'll put it at 36. And this just provides some isolation from the two areas. And on this side, I'm just going to turn it off. And because we know that when we distort this side, or saturate it, it's not going to produce anything that's going to show up over here. We know that this side's pretty much being left alone. We're not really going to touch it. It's going to be preserved. So let's go ahead over here and just listen to it. So now what I want to do is let's go ahead and just see what we can do with some color. I'm going to grab tape and I'm going to go for old tape. Old tape adds quite a bit, so it'll be a much more obvious example. And let's go ahead and just drive it up and see what we get. I like right around there. And at this point, I might fiddle with the crossover and see if I like it on the lower side or on the higher side. I'm just going to bring it down a smidge. All right, now let's go ahead and try out that other thing that we were talking about, this dynamics over here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring the dynamics up and just give you a second to really quick just process what exactly it's doing to the sound, knowing that this is going to change the shape of the wave, which is going to change how it interacts with the drive and the harmonics that are generated. And notice that because we're pulling up things that were originally quiet, remember that these kinds of sounds, right, they decay over time, and that's what gives them the shortness of their sound, right? Like if we had a pluck sound, it decays very quickly. But as soon as we start pulling that stuff up, it's going to sound longer and sustained. So in this case, this is going to add some mud. So we want to be really, really careful with this decision. But that's why it sounds distinctly longer than it did before. We might dial that back. Now, if we go the other way, it'll sound much shorter. It emphasizes things in the opposite direction. And I actually might be interested in doing this and then normalizing it after compressing this side. It would be an interesting experiment. But you could get some really, really cool different ambiances by just sort of messing with these things. And now we have somewhat of an idea of what we're doing. At this point, we might go ahead and start messing around with different colors. We might say, hey, you know, old tape sounded cool. Let's try out warm tape. And so you begin to make decisions like this, and you're able to just sort of fit things into a mix. Like this is a much brighter guitar than it was before, and we've left the low end alone. We can go ahead and continue to process it as we see fit. And if I go ahead and just turn this off, let's just do a before and after. So this was before. Now let's go ahead and do after. especially at moments right here where we get a bit louder, you can notice that it comes out a lot brighter than it did before. And in this case, I think that's a good thing. So let's go ahead and just audition that one section. So here it is before, and here it is after. And that's something that right there, when I find a moment like that where I think, oh, this is a bit bigger of a difference than in other places, that might be a prime candidate to sort of try out the different modes. Like we might try out old tape here. And then we might go ahead and say, hey, what about saturation? Let's go for a heavy saturation. Do you see what that sounds like? We say, okay, maybe not heavy. Let's go for something like subtle. Oh, you know what? This one might be the winner for me. I don't know if you can tell. If you're wearing headphones, you probably can, but you can spatially position that a lot better than any of the previous ones. And so for that reason, I might actually side with this one. And actually it'd be interesting to do an A-B. So here's before. And then here's after. So there's a little bit about saturation and some general principles you can use and be pretty confident with what you're doing and why you're grabbing the tool that you're grabbing and what you can expect to get out of that tool. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Subscribe and hit that bell icon for future videos, and have a blessed day.